Hey Tracy, I had a great download last night. I've been working on that video, the words of spells too, and looking at homophones and the dual meaning of words, how words can be hidden in other words. And I was thinking of the saying, Jesus is the only way. Jesus is the way. And it struck me, which I haven't ever saw anybody else state or decode, so I feel this is fresh. That Jesus is the way. So what is Jesus? Jesus is the end product. Jesus is the end product of a process, the way. Now we normally associate the way with a path and a type of process, which it is, but the hiddenness of this is in the word, and instead of spelling it W-A-Y, it needs to be spelled W-H-E-Y. Jesus is the way. Now the way is the byproduct of milk turning to cheese, which goes through a transmutation, many of a chemical process. If we were to relate the process that milk goes through to turn into cheese, and then from cheese the whey, and the process that the whey goes through, it's the same as the chemical process of man, of transmutation of the self, which we see in all of the old scripture, which I have learned so well. The death of the ego and this and that and this, it all relates to the process of whey. And there's different types of whey. You've got sweet whey and you've got acidic whey. Sweet whey comes from cheese. Jesus, like Jesus, cheese. And the sweet whey is one of the products of the process that milk undergoes to turn into cheese. But if we turned milk into yogurt, which I see the word yogi, it becomes acidic, and it's a different variation of sweet whey. So I see these, the two paths, the two sides, the Jesus and maybe the Antichrist, the Jesus and the dark magician, the yogi, which is in the name yogurt, and Jesus in the name cheese. And it's just a beautiful kind of download, the only way out. The way out. And when we, you've got weighers in the weighing scales as well, which we could relate to the heart and the light of the heart, which is correct again, just like the way of the path. But the way in terms of the way of protein, which, ultimately has been lost as well. We seem to have lost the way, and now we seem to have rediscovered it. And isn't it funny that whey's being used in, say, the last 10, 20, 30 years in all the protein shakes, and it's really blossomed in, say, the last 50 years. So it seems like we found the way again, physically. And in the world, we seem to have found the way, and we're using it, which we have used for, many centuries in different things, but it was never identified till it has been now. So you've got the way, and the way has been found again and is being used again, just like in spiritual, in the path, people are now finding the way. It seems to interlink in this beautiful, magnificent way. It's just a pun of words it turns into, isn't it? So Jesus is the way, and the way is transmutation and a chemical process, which I've told people for so long that Jesus' parables and sayings were all to do with the self and finding yourself. And what way is essentially the end product of a process and a chemical process, which relates to wheat and wine and all the other things that Jesus spoke about. And then from the, say the wheat, we can turn the wheat into flour, and the flour into bread, and bread is the rising of Jesus Christ. And remember, the wheat has to be hung and dry. That would be the crucifixion. And the transmutation that Jesus went through from a boy could be related to the planting of a wheat seed, all the way to its maturity and chopping down for it to be dried and hung and then put in a dark place, like Jesus being put in the tomb, only for it to transmute even further into dough and be put in the final heat for it to rise like bread. And you know, that bread ultimately represents food, which is knowledge and wisdom, which could be shared amongst many. And it's one of the things that Jesus spoke about in the Bible. So I'm not here to argue whether Jesus was a man or not, but what I can argue and what I can prove is the sayings and the parables are all pointing to the self. And Jesus is the way, ultimately equates to Jesus is what is left over. And once we have discarded all of the waste and all of the material in ourselves that is essentially corruption or bacteria, we clean ourselves and come out with the purest essence, like in alchemy. And one of those elements could be seen as whey, which goes through many processes which could be related to Jesus. It's so funny as well, because when we look at the wheat progress of how wheat transpires, it gets broken up into 99 parts, which is Jesus's age times 3, so 33 times 3, 3, 3, 3, which again to me hints at something. And when we look at process or stage 33, we can see what it highlights. And then we go to 66, but 66 doesn't seem to be there, but it's 69. And that's a very key process. And then 99 is ultimately, you know, the end. So the end of the cycle. So even the numbers of wheat relate to it. I hope this helps, man. And you know, and I hope it proves that the parables are about the self, and rather than people looking outside of themselves and idolizing something else, they look within and transmute themselves to leave their self with the base form, something much purer from the base form, or I should say, the end product, which could be seen as the way, what is left of the process. The parables of Jesus have long been misunderstood, taken literally, taken as something outside of oneself, when all of Jesus' sayings, teachings and parables were all to do with the transmutation of oneself and the caring of other beings. So ultimately lifting one higher and the spreading of love. There has been countless arguments over these parables and sayings and whether Jesus was a man or whether he's a myth, when this does not need to happen. All we need to do is look at the words and see them for what they are. The parables can lead one to their true self. The parables will learn one to love the world, understand its duality, and understand we must stay constant, consistent, and not on the weighing scales, so to speak, shifting from side to side. What Jesus teaches is to transcend oneself into something much purer, or ultimately to reveal what is already there, the beauty inside man, and the pureness which has been veiled. If we take the whole process of how whey is made, it is the same, as I say, as the alchemical process of transmuting oneself. The alchemical process generally starts off by breaking down the worldly attachments, desires, status, wealth, our identity, known as the black stage, referring to the burning of all the elements of ourselves that we no longer require and no longer serve us. A similar process can be seen with the milk, turning it into cheese and the byproduct of whey. Stage 2 generally has always different names, all these stages, but generally involves dissolving, and this can be a process which involves water, which again links to the process of milk, cheese and whey. It's ultimately the dissolution, where we free ourselves from our identity. Stage 3 of the alchemical process would be the separation stage. Separation from one's habits and thought processes, emotional trigger responses, in order to step back and distinguish our essence from our acquired personality. Separation is the freeing stage, ultimately referring to when the milk separates into curds and other like processes. The next stage can generally be seen as conjunction. We see what still remains in us after getting rid of all the waste elements. What's left is of value, and then we begin combining these elements into ourselves to form the authentic self. For a long time, I believe whey itself was considered a waste product, or at least we've been told that. In the last century or so, we saw it be used with baby milk, and protein powder has already been mentioned, just to name a few things. But ultimately, with this point aside, that product can be transmutated itself. Everything can be transmutated. It's just the essence of something. I feel like this highlights, for a long time we lost the way, and now we seem to be returning to the way in the physical and spiritual sense, with people taking a lot of way and people also finding the way. It's a paradoxical comedy. We start to feel unified in body and soul. The two polarities cease their conflict and come together, male and female, body and soul, spirit and matter. Harmony is achieved through the different elements. Then it can be seen as a fermentation process of such, again which can be related to cheese. The decaying of oneself and the rebirth of one's true self. The previous stage generally involved discarding the old self and drawing together authentic elements within us, and this stage is likened to the rebirth of the phoenix from its own ashes. We get a glimpse of the more refined, authentic self, purification and spiritualization. Purification, the rotting away of our former selves. This within ourselves can also lead to despair and depression as we're losing our old self, our identity, but it can also lead to the spiritualization, where it gives a great relief to see the world in a new, luminous way. It involves letting go of all parts of ourselves, a mix of feelings in some stages. And this would ultimately be getting rid of any bacterias in the milk or the whey that are left over, a further processing part of that procedure. Again, I'm no chemist or scientist, anything like that, but this to me is common sense. I'm great with analogies, seeing metaphors and seeing truth. Ultimately, I can see the way whey is processed through milk and cheese is the exact same formula for the transmutation of the self, hinting at Jesus is the way, which is a transmutation or a process. Distillation is when all the impurities are removed and there's nothing left but the essence, just that essence, and that ultimately for us would be the whey in its purest form. The final stage is coagulation, which is the solidification of one's essential self to become whole. So it's the final process in which by the liquid solidifies. So this would be our end product of whey being dried. Coagulation involves the complete unification of polarities, spirit and matter, body and soul, masculine and feminine, to form a single whole. In this final stage, one's higher self emerges, and it can be likened to the point of when gold cools and solidifies. This is ultimately the purest of purest, Jesus, God, Christ. For me, it's pretty clear to see the message and to see how this needs to be implemented in oneself to rid us of all of our impurities. But it's not just as simple as that. It's not just a case of that. It's a process. Many stages involved. It's not just one thing into the next. It's many stages. First we identify, we separate, we burn. The burning and the heat in terms of what happens in the whey process could be ourselves, where we have to pressure ourselves. Generally, these type of situations happen after hard work or extreme pressure of pushing oneself or trauma, which it pressurizes and then cools back down. The whey process exactly happens in the human as well. Or something that I've gone through myself. I've gone through these chemical stages, and although I may not say that I am set in gold as yet, I am aware and I have found and I see what I truly am. And only that truth will set you free, because there is no you to escape this. And when you find this truth, you will let go. We all agree that we must let go of all attachments in the world to transcend, but we forget one, and that is the self, the full self, the personality, that which is not essence. Everything must be transmuted until it is pure essence again. It reminds me of an old story. And there is a man, and he preaches all his life the greats of God. And he arrives at heaven's doors or God's gates and asks, "Can I come in?" And God responds no and sends him away. The man goes away, questions why, tries to come up with some more good deeds and goes back and asks to be let in again. He's refused. He goes away, comes back again, tries, he's refused. Finally he asks, "Why am I being refused?" The response is, "Because there is no I." All is one, and no one can enter heaven. There are no individual I's at source. All is one. And the story, although I have not explained it well, is basically saying egos cannot be let into heaven. And ego might be the wrong word, but I feel you can grasp what I mean. All that has to be left behind, absolutely everything. And heaven is just yourself, just the purest element which is already there, just failed. And only when you drop the false I can you fall back into pureness. And one of the most interesting things about way is there are multiple processes or ways, methods to gain way. There are harsh methods and soft methods. Now the harsh methods generally involve chemicals, and this in terms of ourselves can be likened to the use of substance to find the way. The other way is much softer and produces a different type of way, yes, but what I'm trying to highlight is there are multiple ways to get to the way, or to find the way. With this said, we should not judge how people find the way, as long as they find the way. To add even more value to the process of whey and cheese, we look at the Shroud of Turin, which was a linen cloth that bared a faint image. The Catholic Church believed it was Jesus Christ. Now, one of the processes involved in cheese is the straining of the cheese through linen cloth, which would ultimately leave an imprint, the same we see in the Shroud of Turin, adding even more value to Jesus is the way. The process can also be seen as the same as wheat. From seed, it sprouts, shoots. The wheat plants produce multiple stems. The wheat stems grow in length. The grain is filtered. The wheat develops and accumulates proteins and other such things. It ripens and matures, and this can all be seen as the stages of Jesus' birth, childhood, into maturity, into the ripening and mature age of 33, until the harvesting, where wheat plants are cut and separated. And this relates again to the transmutation of the self, the killing of the ego, then the cleaning and grading of the wheat. Wheat needs to be dried, and the drying process generally involves lying it across on flooring which resembles the cross. It's cleaned and all impurities taken out, sorted out by its quality, and finally the milling and the processing of that wheat grain is ground and turned into flour and other such things. And it's funny where flour is stored, in dark places, such as where Jesus' body was stored. The most common thing to turn flour into is bread, and once the flour has been combined with other ingredients, other attributes, it becomes a dough and can be placed in an oven, again in the transmutation, representing the final burning, the formation of its highest form. It rises and becomes bread, the food that Jesus is told to have shared out. And without going into it, you could easily see how the wine can also be a parable for this. The process to get wine from grape is long, and there is many processes involved. Again, transmutation. Even the fish, when you think about it, takes much, and there is a process to getting the fish to a stage where it can be shared amongst others, like wisdom, knowledge, food that can be shared. The fish must first be caught. Once caught, scaled, opened up, cleaned, the guts and all badness removed. Whilst the best parts harvested and taken, the fish goes through further process before being cooked, finally to be ate. The wheat becomes flour, the flour becomes bread, all part of a process of transmutation into a higher form. The bread is then shared and consumed. As the bread becomes its entirety, it is shared amongst all, just like the very fabric of existence and God. It's shared amongst all. The very representation of sacrifice and love, the sharing of oneself, bread, food, wisdom, more than knowledge, the sacrificing of oneself whilst reaching its highest point to share its fruit, its wisdom and knowledge, and that is all we can do. Jesus is the way. You now know the way, love and light.